The studio lights beamed down as the tension in the air thickened. The usually confident and composed liberal TV host, Daniel Reeves, shifted uneasily in his chair. His guest, Karoline Leavitt, sat across from him, poised and unwavering. The UA controversy surrounding the $800 million lawsuit had taken the media by storm. And now, face to face, Daniel was about to make an unprecedented plea. "Karoline, I know we don't agree on much," Daniel started, his voice measured but urgent. "But this lawsuit, this $800 million battle, will have consequences beyond what anyone expects." Karoline leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "Consequences for whom, Daniel? The people who lied? The institutions that misled millions?" Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, I get it. You feel wronged, and maybe you were. But dragging this out in court, pushing for such an astronomical sum, it's not just about you anymore. It's about the precedent it sets. The ripple effects. Do you really want to be responsible for that?" Karoline tilted her head, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "Responsible for holding people accountable?" "Yes, I do." Daniel shook his head. "I'm talking about the chilling effect on speech, on journalism, on open debate. If this lawsuit succeeds, what's next? Where does it end?" Karoline exhaled, her patience clearly thinning. "Daniel, you and your network spent years pushing narratives without concern for truth. And now, when it's time to answer for it, you want to frame this as a free speech issue?" Daniel spread his hands. "I'm saying let's find another way. A settlement, a conversation, something other than this scorched earth approach that could change the media landscape forever." Karoline's eyes narrowed. "You mean something that lets your side off the hook?" Daniel hesitated. He had expected resistance, but not this level of steadfast determination. "I mean something that doesn't destroy lives in the process," he finally said. Karoline leaned back, arms crossed. "Lives were already destroyed, Daniel. Maybe it's time for some accountability." The silence between them was deafening as the cameras captured every second. Daniel swallowed hard, realizing that his usual tactics, emotional appeals, strategic wordplay, weren't shaking Karoline's resolve. The weight of the moment pressed on him. This wasn't just another heated debate for the cameras. This was a direct plea, a desperate attempt to stop what could become one of the most impactful legal battles in modern media history. Karoline studied him for a moment before speaking again, her tone calm but firm. "You want me to walk away from this, Daniel? To just let it go? Tell me, where was this concern when people like me were slandered, labeled, and silenced? Where was this plea for fairness when reputations were ruined with no recourse?" Daniel sighed. "I'm not saying it was right, but you have to understand this lawsuit, at this scale, it's going to set a precedent that we might all regret." Karoline's expression didn't change. "That's the problem, Daniel. You and your colleagues only care about consequences when they affect you. For years, the media played judge, jury, and executioner. Now, when justice is knocking on your door, suddenly it's about the bigger picture." Daniel leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "It's not just about us. If this case moves forward and succeeds the way you want, it could change journalism forever. Even the platforms you support, conservative media, independent voices, they'll be at risk too. This isn't just about holding a few bad actors accountable. It's about the future of free speech itself." Karoline let out a soft chuckle. "You know what's funny, Daniel? Free speech was never a concern when my side was getting censored, banned, and demonetized. When we spoke up, we were labeled as threats, extremists, whatever fit the narrative. But now that accountability is coming for you, it's a crisis. Forgive me if I don't share your sudden concern for fairness." Daniel could feel the walls closing in. He had expected pushback, but Karoline's unwavering stance was making it clear she wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to see this through. "I just don't want this to spiral out of control," Daniel finally admitted, his voice softer now. Karoline nodded. Maybe you should have thought about that before your network spread lies. Before you dismissed people like me as conspiracy theorists. Before you destroyed lives with reckless reporting. She stood up, adjusting her blazer. You want this lawsuit to go away, Daniel? Then maybe next time, you and your colleagues should be more careful with the truth. With that, she walked off the set, leaving Daniel sitting there stunned as the cameras continued rolling. The studio remained eerily silent as Karoline exited, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor fading into the distance. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. The producers behind the cameras exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment linger. He finally exhaled, rubbing his temples. This was not how he had planned the conversation to go. He had expected resistance, of course. Karoline Leavitt wasn't known for backing down, but he had underestimated just how unshakable she would be. A voice crackled in his earpiece. Daniel, we need to wrap. He nodded absently. Yeah, let's go to break. The screen cut to commercial, but even off-air, the tension in the room remained thick. Daniel turned to his producers, shaking his head. That didn't go well. One of them, a younger man with a tablet in hand, cleared his throat. Actually, the engagement numbers are through the roof. Social media is already exploding. People are picking sides. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Of course they were. That was how it always worked. The spectacle, the drama, people ate it up. But he hadn't wanted viral clips or trending hashtags this time. He had wanted a resolution, a way to put this lawsuit behind them before it did irreversible damage. Another producer spoke up. Legal's asking if she hinted at any settlements off camera. Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. No, she's going all the way with this. She made that crystal clear. The control room buzzed with murmurs as analysts and executives debated the fallout. Some were already discussing strategies, spinning narratives to counter the momentum Karoline had just built. Daniel, however, felt something different creeping into his mind. Doubt. He had always believed in the mission of his network, in their responsibility to challenge the narratives they saw as dangerous. But what if they had, at some point, crossed a line? What if this lawsuit wasn't just a political stunt but a necessary reckoning? The thought unsettled him. A producer tapped him on the shoulder. Daniel, you're back on in 60 seconds. He straightened up, adjusting his tie. No time for doubts now. He had a network to defend, an audience to address. The war over the truth wasn't ending anytime soon, and he had a role to play. The countdown began and the camera light flickered back to life. Daniel plastered on a composed expression. Welcome back, he said, voice steady. If you're just tuning in, you missed quite the conversation. Daniel took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain control of the narrative. The screen behind him flashed with a still image of Karoline Leavitt from moments ago, her expression firm, unwavering. The producers had already lined up sound bites for the next segment, clips of her most cutting remarks, ready to be dissected, analyzed, and spun in real time. He shifted in his seat and looked directly into the camera. If you're just joining us, we had Karoline Leavitt on moments ago, and let me tell you, she made one thing very clear. This lawsuit is personal, and it's not just about accountability, as she claims. It's about power. A graphic popped up on the screen. $800 million, a threat to free speech, Daniel continued, his tone measured but urgent. This is bigger than one lawsuit. If this case succeeds, it could change the very fabric of journalism. It could silence not just large networks but independent voices. Conservative, liberal, everyone. The question is, does Karoline Leavitt and her supporters understand what they're unleashing? A second clip played, showing Karoline's final words before she walked off. The control room had edited it perfectly, zooming in on her unwavering expression as she said, "Maybe next time, you and your colleagues should be more careful with the truth." Daniel shook his head, sighing. That's the rhetoric we're dealing with. No room for discussion, no room for fairness, just a desire to punish. His earpiece buzzed again. Phones are lighting up. This is getting traction fast. Good. That meant the audience was engaged, outraged, ready to fight. A producer signaled for him to take a caller, and within seconds, the voice of a longtime listener boomed through the speakers. "Daniel, I've watched your show for years, but I gotta be honest. Karoline made some good points." Daniel's stomach twisted slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. "Go on." "Well," the caller hesitated, "she's right, isn't she? Your network has gotten things wrong before. And when it happens to conservatives, nobody seems to care. But now, when it's your turn to face the consequences, suddenly it's all about free speech?" Daniel forced a chuckle. "I appreciate the perspective, but let me ask you this. Should one lawsuit have the power to dictate what journalists can and can't say? Because that's the danger here. If every mistake leads to an $800 million price tag, what happens to open debate?" As the show wrapped up for the night, Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling into his bones. The control room buzzed with activity, producers dissecting the interview, social media analysts tracking engagement, legal teams preparing responses. It was all part of the machine, a cycle he had been part of for years, but tonight felt different. His phone vibrated on the desk, a message from an unknown number. "You look desperate out there. The lawsuit isn't going away. Get used to it." Daniel exhaled sharply. Karoline. He clenched his jaw, debating whether to respond. What would he even say? He had tried reasoning with her, offering an olive branch in front of millions, and she had rejected it without hesitation. Now, she was sending him messages just to twist the knife. Instead of replying, he tossed the phone onto the desk and stood. "Up, boss?" one of the producers called, walking up beside him. "The numbers are massive. That interview is everywhere. Clips trending on Twitter, YouTube, even conservative sites are picking it up." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I figured." The producer hesitated. "Look, I gotta ask, do you think she actually has a case? Like, is there a chance this lawsuit doesn't just go away?" Daniel ran a hand down his face. He didn't want to admit it, not even to himself, but deep down he knew the answer. "Yeah," he muttered. "There's a chance." The producer didn't press further. He just nodded and walked off, leaving Daniel alone in the dimly lit studio. For years, he had been the one asking the tough questions, setting the narrative, controlling the conversation. But now, the tables were turning. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just another guest. She was a force to be reckoned with. And if she won this lawsuit, it wouldn't just be a victory for her, it would be a reckoning for the entire media industry. Daniel Reeves had spent his career fighting to shape the truth. But for the first time, he wondered if the truth was about to shape him. Daniel left the studio, his mind racing as he stepped into the cold night air. The city lights shimmered around him, but he barely noticed. The weight of what had just happened sat heavy on his shoulders. He had tried, pleaded, to make Karoline see reason, but she hadn't budged. If anything, she seemed more determined than ever. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A familiar voice came through. "You didn't really think one interview would change my mind, did you?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Karoline, you tried to frame it like I was being unreasonable," she said. "Like this lawsuit is about power, not justice. But you know the truth, Daniel. That's why you looked so rattled out there." He ran a hand through his hair, glancing around as if someone might be watching. "I was trying to stop this from escalating. You're playing with fire, Karoline." She chuckled. "No, Daniel, you are. Your network thought it could say whatever it wanted without consequences. That time is over." Daniel exhaled sharply. "And what happens when this comes back to bite your side? When conservative media gets hit with lawsuits for things they say? When your allies start facing the same legal warfare you're waging now?" Karoline was silent for a moment, then said, "If you think that justifies what your network did, then you've already lost the argument." Daniel clenched his fist. "So that's it then? No negotiation? No settlement?" "No," she said simply. "Not this time." The call ended. Daniel stood there staring at the phone, the screen glowing in the darkness. He had spent years dismantling arguments, breaking down opponents on live television. But Karoline Leavitt was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was making a statement. And worst of all, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that, deep down, she might actually be right. Daniel pocketed his phone, his fingers twitching as he tried to process everything. The night air did little to cool the heat of frustration burning inside him. He had faced tough guests before, had debated politicians, activists, and industry leaders, but this was different. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just making a point. She was making a move that could change everything. His driver was waiting by the curb, the black sedan's engine humming softly. Daniel slid into the back seat, shutting the door with more force than necessary. "Home, sir?" the driver asked. Daniel hesitated. His mind was still spinning and he knew sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. "No," he muttered. "Take me to the office." The driver nodded and pulled into the traffic. The city blurred past, but Daniel barely noticed. He opened his phone and scrolled through the headlines. Every major outlet, conservative and liberal alike, was talking about the interview. Clips were circulating at an insane speed, hashtags were trending, and commentary was flooding in from all sides. Karoline Leavitt stands her ground against liberal host. Daniel Reeves tries and fails to talk Leavitt out of massive lawsuit. Is the media finally facing its reckoning? His own network was already in damage control mode. A producer had texted him a rundown of talking points they wanted to push in the morning. He skimmed through them, but they all read the same: spin, spin, spin. Daniel rubbed his temple. They still thought this was just another PR battle, another scandal to weather. But this wasn't some passing controversy. This was war. His phone rang again. This time the caller ID was familiar. Elliot Barnes, the network's top legal counsel. Daniel answered immediately. "Tell me you have good news." Elliot sighed. "That depends on what you consider good news." "Don't play games with me, Elliot." There was a pause. "The board's getting nervous. This lawsuit isn't just going to be expensive, Daniel. It could get ugly. Really ugly." Daniel pinched the bridge of his nose. "Meaning?" "Meaning Karoline's team isn't just going for a settlement. They want to drag this into the public eye. Discovery, depositions, internal communications, everything. If this lawsuit moves forward, we're going to have to hand over documents, emails, strategy memos, stuff that could be damning." Daniel finished. Elliot hesitated. "Let's just say it won't be helpful." Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had been in the media business long enough to know that every network, no matter which side they leaned on, had skeletons. If Karoline's lawsuit forced them to open their books, there was no telling what could come out. "All right," Daniel said, voice low. "Worst case scenario?" Elliot exhaled. "We lose. Big. The damages alone could cripple the network. But more than that, it would send a message that media can be held accountable for what they say. And that, my friend, is a precedent that no one in our industry wants." Daniel stared out the window, watching the city rush by. He had spent years believing his network was untouchable, that no matter how heated things got, no matter how aggressive the rhetoric became, they would always land on their feet. But now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. "Daniel," Elliot said, his voice more serious than before, "we need to talk strategy. Because if Karoline isn't backing down, then we have two choices: fight harder than we ever have, or find a way to kill this lawsuit before it kills us." Daniel took a deep breath. He had fought plenty of battles in his career, but something told him this was the one that would define everything. "Set up a meeting," he said finally. "First thing in the morning." "Done," Elliot replied. "And Daniel?" "Yeah?" "Get some sleep," Elliot said. "You're going to need it." The call ended, but Daniel didn't put his phone down. Instead, he stared at the screen, his mind racing. Karoline had made her move. Now it was his turn. Daniel arrived at the network's headquarters just before dawn, the towering glass building reflecting the city's early morning glow. Inside, The newsroom was already humming with activity. Producers prepping segments, researchers digging into new angles, legal analysts whispering in tense huddles. Everyone knew what was at stake. He took the elevator up to the executive floor, his mind replaying every word of last night's interview. He had underestimated Karoline. She hadn't just been confident, she had been strategic. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew exactly how much power she wielded. The doors slid open, and Daniel stepped into the boardroom where Elliot Barnes and a handful of senior executives were already seated. Elliot didn't waste time. "We're in trouble." Daniel dropped into a chair. "Tell me something I don't know." The meeting was set for that evening. Karoline had agreed to meet in a private suite at an upscale hotel, away from cameras, reporters, and prying eyes. It wasn't surprising. She wasn't reckless. She knew the weight of what was happening, and if she had even the slightest interest in their offer, she wouldn't want anyone to know she had entertained it. Daniel arrived early, dressed sharply but not overly formal. He needed to project confidence, not desperation. The suite was sleek and modern, the city skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. A bottle of wine sat on the table, Elliot's idea, not his. He checked his watch. 5 minutes. Later, the door opened and Karoline Leavitt stepped inside. She was composed, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said, setting her handbag down. "I have to admit, I was curious." Daniel gestured to the seat across from him. "Then, let's not waste time." She sat, crossing her legs. "I assume you're not here to beg me to drop the lawsuit again. You already tried that and we both know how it went." Daniel smirked. "No, this time I'm offering you something better." She arched an eyebrow but said nothing. He leaned forward. "You want accountability in the media. You want to expose, bias, hold networks responsible, challenge the establishment. I'm giving you the chance to do that, not from the outside but from within." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on. A regular platform. Weekly segments. Your own voice. Unfiltered. You call out misinformation, bias, whatever you see fit. Real impact in front of millions. Not just conservative audiences, everyone." She studied him for a long moment. Then she chuckled, shaking her head. "Let me get this straight. You want me to work with the same network I'm suing for $800 million? I want to turn this fight into something productive," Daniel countered. "You say this lawsuit is about truth, not money. Prove it. You don't need a courtroom to hold the media accountable. You need a microphone." Karoline tapped her fingers against the armrest, considering. Daniel watched her closely. He had interviewed enough people in his career to recognize when someone was tempted. She wasn't dismissing the idea outright. Finally, she spoke. "And what happens when I say something your network doesn't like? When I call out your executives? When I expose the next lie?" Daniel smiled. "Then we air it." She scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" He spread his hands. "Believe whatever you want. But here's the reality. You could drag this lawsuit out for years. Or you could step onto a stage right now and make a difference." She held his gaze. "And if I refuse?" Daniel's smile didn't waver. "Then we go to war." Silence hung between them. The city lights cast long shadows across the room, the stakes heavier than either of them let on. Finally, Karoline stood. "I'll think about it." Daniel nodded. That was all he needed. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You're smart, Daniel. But you're also afraid. You wouldn't be offering me this if you weren't." Then she was gone. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temple. She was right. He was afraid. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure if the media was playing offense anymore. Maybe, just maybe, Karoline Leavitt was.